Thank you so much. I'm very happy to join this Herodotian community, and I'm happy to meet some old and new friends. After a whole history of studies, setting the pre-Greek population of the Pelasgians into the right context is still an extremely complex matter. John Myers, many years ago, wrote, quote, "Like the Phoenicians, the Celts, and of recent years the Teutons, they, the Pelasgians, have been a peg upon which to hang all sorts of speculation. And whenever an inconvenient circumstance has deranged the symmetry of a theory, it has been safe to call it Pelasgian and pass on. The past researches have changed the situation, at least for the Phoenician and Celts, while of the Teutons I cannot say. The Pelasgian, too, of which no archaeological traces have been detected, are still a mysterious thing, as they were for the Greeks and Romans. My research does not aspire to determine the Pelasgian matter, which most likely is insolvable, but aims to frame in a conceivable context some of the most relevant testimonies in the attempt to identify the threads of tradition that span from Homeric exegesis to Strabo. Let us begin with Hecataeus of Miletus, whom the textbooks used to wrongly consider the first historian of the Greek literature. Text 1. In his detailed description from west to east, after dealing with Iberia, Gaul, and Italy, Strabo eats towards the northern regions and dwells upon the Balkan Peninsula. He then steers down to Greece. I chose to quote the whole Strabo's paragraph in order to place the fragment, or we should better say the excerptum of Hecataeus, in the right context. Also, it often happens that the beginning and not the end of the quotation is indicated, as in this case. Quoting the complete paragraph can support at better following Strabo's line of reasoning. Let's now begin with the problem of the quotation limits. Strabo may have taken from Hecataeus only the statement about Greece being inhabited by the barbarians before the arrival of the Greeks, Hecataeus, Menuno, Milesios, Perites Peloponnesu, Fesin, and so on. Or he might also have derived from him the immediately following argument concerning migrations to Greece and pre-Greek peoples, Skedon, Detica, Iesumpa, Hellas, Katoikia, Barbaron, and so on. Jacobi was inclined towards this second hypothesis. The first two characters to be mentioned are Pelops, who is said to have come from Phrygia, and Danaus, from Egypt. From the former, the name Peloponnesus would originate. From the latter, the collective name of Danaans. In Epos, these designate the members of the Greek army against Troy. Then the peoples that shaped Greece are listed: Dryopians, Caucones, Pelasgians, and Leleges. As a further proof, it is recalled that Attica was occupied by the Thracian of Eumolpus, Daulis in Phocis by Tyreus, and so on. This really is a true geography of myth. Strabo's argument continues with the search for barbarian names in the oldest sagas, Cecrops, Codrus, and others, with the exception of the last one, Crinacus, to be associated with Boeotia. These are all characters connected to Attica. At last, evidence is adduced for the Mecranian presence of barbarians, Thracians, Illyrians, on the flanks of the territories inhabited by the Greeks. In former times, the regions occupied by the barbarians would have been larger and more numerous. This approach is comparable to the one developed by Thucydides in his archaeology. The present situation works as a tool to reconstruct the ancient status of Greece. I'm not going to track the characters and peoples named by Strabo in epic poetry. I'm interested here at understanding, 1, the reason for Hecataeus and Strabo's interest in the topic of migration, 2, how this topic works and is resolved, 3, its relationship with other positions, for example, the Athenian one, according to which the Athenians are indigenous. Hecataeus' assertion would seem to be limited to Peloponnesus, and what follows could be the result of Strabo's reasoning. But on this delicate matter, I consider it prudent to suspend our judgment, so that from now on I will focus on Hecataeus/Strabo. Herodotus. Point 2. The origin of the Greeks has been famously addressed by Herodotus in Book 1 in a digression arising from Croesus' interest in Greek matters and from the acknowledgement of the supremacy of Sparta and Athens in Greece. Herodotus first takes into examination the wanderings of the Spartans, text 2a. We encounter here two peoples, regions, also mentioned in Strabo's passage, the Cadmeans and the Dryopians, through Dryopis. Another people appearing in both passages are our Pelasgians, the ancestors of the Athenians. I do not address the matter of historical authenticity of the Pelasgians, i.e. whether they were people made up by the Greeks to explain who the inhabitants of Greece were before the arrival of the Dorians and Greeks. Even if the Pelasgians never existed, it would still be relevant to study the tradition about them, fabricated or not. Indeed, by studying the Pelasgians, we do not add much to our knowledge of Greece in the second millennium, but we do have a clearer idea of how the Greeks defined their identity and origins. The following section concerning the language of the Pelasgians confirms their nature as a barbarian people, also on linguistic terms. Text 2b. Herodotus' method is circumstantial, tekmairomenon, repeated twice, and is based on the language spoken in alleged Pelasgian cities of the present and the past. The assumption is clear. According to the evidence, and thus trusting in, the Pelasgians spoke a barbarian language. The Athenians, having passed among the Greeks, i.e. finding themselves in a Greek-speaking context, would have then changed their language. In the close of the digression, the linguistic continuity of the Greeks and their demographic growth is remarked. Text 2c. The Greeks, or according to McNeill's interpretation, part of the Athenians speaking Greek would have always used the same language, and due also to the contribution of other barbarian peoples, would have grown considerably apart from the Pelasgians. The Pelasgians, on the contrary, would have never grown much. Herodotus relies on the Greek-barbarian linguistic opposition to state that native Athenians were originally barbarians, i.e. not Greeks, and would later have become Greeks by adopting the Greek language. I cannot here examine the many problems connected to this passage, from Crestone to the origin of the Etruscans, recalled by Hupertius and on. So I will, 1, focus on McNeill's observation, according to whom Herodotus puts together various traditions without trying to arrange them in a whole. 2, try to point out Herodotus' themes which appear different from those selected by other authors dealing with the same problems. In Herodotus' work, the Pelasgian trade emerges in various passages, and often unexpectedly in digressions concerning the remotest of the past. In Book 1, 146, where Herodotus argues the idea of the ethnic purity of the Ionians of Asia, the Pelasgians appear together with other peoples, including the Cadmeans, Dryopians, and Dorians. Speaking of the names of the gods, Herodotus makes a distinction between those of Egyptian origin from those of Pelasgian origins. The text 2d is extremely interesting for our purpose. In this paragraph, the Pelasgians are credited with the use of Hermes with the straight member. The Athenians are said to have been the first to adopt this custom. This assertion doesn't seem to match with what Herodotus claims in Book 1, chapter 57. And again, Herodotus provides information about the mystery of the Cabiri arrived in Athens from the Pelasgians who lived in Samothrace. In text 2a, Herodotus states that the Pelasgians called the gods theoi and offers a Greek etymology of the term. In text 2f, Herodotus states that the daughters of Danaus brought the mystery of Demeter from Egypt and taught them to the women of the Pelasgians. He continues, afterwards, when the peoples of the text 2f, when the people of the Peloponnese were driven out by the Dorians, it was lost except in so far it was preserved by the Arcadians, the Peloponnesian people, which was not driven out but left in its home. In the frame of an archaeological digression, the Pelasgians who have kidnapped the Athenian women in Brauron are reminded for driving out the descendants of the Argonauts, Book 4, 145. This is not in the handout. About the extremely long digression on the conflicts in Attica and Lemnos between Athenians and Pelasgians, which Herodotus describes in reference to Miltiades and his success in Lemnos, here I can merely point out that Herodotus opposes Hecataeus' assessment of the Pelasgians' expulsion with that of the Athenians, text 2g. The Pelasgians also are back again in text 2h in the catalogue of Xerxes' fleet in Book 7. And Herodotus here confirms the presence of the Pelasgians on the territory of the mainland of Greece and on some islands before the Greeks. The difficulties pointed out by Pietro Vannicelli in his commentary essentially concern the identity of the first nucleus of Greeks, perhaps the Dorians, and the identification of the Pelasgians with peoples of historical times, attempted unsuccessfully by ancient and moderns. Also, in the context of the catalogue, the Greek fleet before Salamis, there is a relation between the Pelasgian and the Athenian contingent. In his commentary, David Ascheri speaks of an unexpected mythographic digression, perhaps motivated by the desire to prepare the reader for the events surrounding the two local kings, Cecrops and Erechtheus. He continues, I quote, the insistence on autochthony perhaps conveys a didactic message concerning the evacuation of Athens, and the possibility of mass emigration to the West. As we shall say, beyond the inconsistencies and problems posed by Herodotus' passage on the Pelasgian, there is no doubt that the issue with which Hecataeus and Herodotus dealt was of interest to the Athenians as ancient states, but I would add, not only to the Athenians. I believe it can be argued that the Pelasgian matter had a number of implications related to the identity of the Greeks, their early history, the issue of the autochthony of certain Greek populations, and the relations of power among cities. And we must keep in mind that the theme of autochthony is ever present with strong prominence in the intentional history of the Epitaphio Logoi. Point 3, Hellanicus. Pelasgian presence in Italy has been truly investigated by Dominique Bacquel. Here, I will only point out the early stages of the tradition identifying the Pelasgian with the Tyrrhenians. Hellanicus of Lesbos supports, text 3, the match of Pelasgians with Tyrrhenians. This correspondence is not attested in Herodotus, who only mention a proximity between the two peoples. According to Hellanicus, the Pelasgians would have called themselves Tyrrhenians once they migrated to Italy, having been forced to that by the Greeks. Text 3. In the passage from Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Hellanicus' opinion doesn't match with that of Myrsilus of Metimna, 3rd century BC, according to whom it was the Tyrrhenians who changed their name to that of Pelasgians because of their many wanderings. Hellanicus' passage consists of a genealogy and a narrative of foundation, a pattern that must have been typical of the early prose writers. Point 4, Thucydides. Herodotus' focus is largely different from that of Thucydides' archaeology. Text 4a. Herodotus and Thucydides share the idea of the autochthony of the Athenians, but in Thucydides the focus stands on migrations caused by the search for better lands and the arrival of groups fleeing from wars or civil conflicts. This perspective, based on economy and politics, is distinctive of the setting of Thucydides' entire works. Moreover, Thucydides' will is crystal clear. He intends to emphasize the constant growth of Attica, always inhabited by the same people, and then strengthened by the arrival of foreigners from Greece, who are welcomed among the citizens. The theme of growth is also a point in the passage by Herodotus, Book 1, 58, focusing on the small entity of both Greeks and Pelasgians at the beginning. But Herodotus is particularly focused on the linguistic fact that the Pelasgians, ancestors of the Athenians, were barbarians. Thucydides, even not touching the language matter in his archaeology, also speak of displacement of peoples, but not of a pre-existing substratum of barbarians. Text 4b. The Pelasgians emerge en passant in the text 4c, where they are described as a population predating Helenus, son of Duke Helion. The feebleness of antiquity is further provided to me by the circumstance that there appears to have been no common action in Hellas before the Trojan War. It's a famous passage. The Pelasgians occur again in text 4d, in Book 4, in the context of Brasidas' conquest in the Chalcidici Peninsula. The Pelasgian element matches with the Tyrrhenians, who inhabited Lemnos and Athens, to which are added the Bysals, the inhabitants of Crestone, and the Edonians, a Thracian population. one cannot fail to notice the partial convergence with Herodotus 157 for Crestone and with Book 6, 137 and followings for Lemnos. In Thucydides, migrations are a particularly relevant aspect in the reconstruction of ancient history, but the Pelasgian matter is marginal and is recalled, as well in the archaeology, only in one case, to explain the diglossia of the inhabitants of some Chalcidic centers. Point 5. The Pelasgian question is addressed in a long passage by Strabo, which can be considered as a sort of autonomous syngramma on this subject, which Giovanni Parmigiani calls the result of a very clear operation of source criticism. Text 5a. This digression originates from a tradition regarding the foundation of Agilla Cere. In Book 5, clearly, in this case, the Pelasgian matter is closely linked to that of the origin of the Etruscans. Strabo works as an expert grammarian in collecting and commenting on sources, poetic and other, and starts from a datum on which he finds almost total consensus, that the Pelasgians were an ancient race widespread in ancient times throughout Greece and especially in Thessaly. Ephorus' opinion that the Pelasgians of Arcadian origins chose the military life and gained fame in Greece and even outside Greece is corroborated by Homer, Odyssey 19, 175-177, where they are mentioned together with the Dorians. The Homeric passage must have set the platform for a philological discussion, the first traces of which can be found perhaps in Hecataeus, fragment 133, with reference to Pelasgus, father of Crannon, hence the city of the same name. The Homeric passage must have been much more debated than the Scholia suggests. In the Scholia, the discussion revolves solely around the adjective tricaikes, which is interpreted either in reference to the tripartition of the Dorians, divided between Euboea, Peloponnesus, and Crete, or in connection to the long hair that the warriors waved and shook in battle. I myself suspect that the Scholia have preserved only a small part of the ancient discussion of the verse, and that what has been lost we must recover through a line of tradition passed down through historians, Herodotus, Thucydides, Ephorus, and geographers, Hecataeus, Strabo. In particular, if we read the Homeric passage after the Achaeans, Eteocratans, and Sidonians, other inhabitants of Crete, Dorians and Pelasgians are mentioned. As a hypothesis, I propose that in the 5th century, as the Greek world was polarized by Sparta and Athens, the opposition between these two cities was traced back to earlier times. Croesus' ambassadorship to Sparta and Athens in Book 1, Aristagoras of Miletus to Sparta and Athens in Book 5. On the other hand, it can be gathered that the Greeks looked again in the epos for a clue to explain a polarization of historical ages. And what better ground could there be than the passage of the Odyssey? It cannot be excluded that Apollodorus, to whom Lasserre attributes the digression on the Pelasgian, entered the discussion. Obviously, the precise identification of a source cannot be one of my priorities. Due to the loss of many texts, these are often risky and conjectural speculations, which I consider less worthwhile than the identification of the lines of ancient tradition. The Pelasgians are referred to as epoikoi in Crete, and the context of the Odyssean passage suggests that they were linguistically distinct from the other inhabitants of the island, since a mixture of languages is mentioned. The presence of the Pelasgian is identified in Thessaly, Pelasgian Argos, and in Dodona, and the opinion of those who consider the peoples of Epirus to be Pelasgian is reported. The notation about the peoples of Epirus and the extent of the presence of the Pelasgians recalls the considerations of Hecataeus Strabo in the passage we started from, in the last lines of the chapter. After the mention of Strabo's Pelasgia, Strabo quotes two verses from the Catalogue of the Trojans, which bring us back to the Anatolian Peninsula. The Arcadian origin of the Pelasgian was supported by Ephorus on the basis of a passage from Hesiod. With Anticlides and the Pelasgian colonial foundations in Lemnos, Imbros, and Italy, we return to where Strabo started. Finally, the presence of the Pelasgians in Athens is hinted on the basis of the authority of the geographers, and the change of their name to Pelargians, storks, is explained because of their habit of migrating from place to place. Further data emerge from Strabo, Book 9, Text 5b. Of this long passage, I only quote paragraph 3, which can be useful compared both with the fragment of Hecataeus, from which we started, and with other passages on the Pelasgian, which we have discussed. The names of the people involved in the migrations largely coincide with those of Strabo, Book 7, the first passage, point 1, which takes a starting point from Hecataeus. One can think of a line of tradition involving several authors, certainly including Hecataeus himself and Ephorus. The two passages of Strabo, in which Hecataeus is quoted, close the circle. The Pelasgians were indeed ancient inhabitants of Greece, but they were people accustomed to migrating frequently, and this would explain their presence in such distant locations. Herodotus and Thucydides move along different terms from this line of tradition, and also their approach is different from one another. Herodotus focuses on the Pelasgian component and linguistic data, probably responding to political needs that were very much all the rage in the 5th century. This might be the reason why Herodotus tried to reconcile Pelasgic origin with autochthony. Kaitome udame ko execorese, Book 1, 56-2. Thucydides has mainly political economic interest. Whilst for Herodotus the Pelasgic matter was important and crucial, already in Thucydides this became very marginal, and migrations are one focus of the archaeology because of their significance in the economic and political dynamics of the earliest times. The interest in the West leads some authors to open up to hypotheses of the migration of Pelasgians to Italy, Hellanicus of Lesbos and Anticlides. In the 4th century, authors interested in history of more ancient times, such as Ephorus, seems to downplay the role of the Pelasgian in Athens by seeking a different explanation for the presence of so many sites possibly related to these people. The Pelasgians are one of the many pre-Greek people involved in the whirlwind of migrations from which the latter structure of Greece would emerge. The geopolitical framework was what changed since the 5th century. There was no longer an opposition between the two Greek powers, Sparta and Athens, but as Xenophon says at the end of the Hellenica, confusion reigned. The matter of the Pelasgians and other pre-Greek peoples became a problem of ancient history, with little or no relation to the present, and was discussed mainly in relation to the interpretation of the poets, witnesses par excellence of ancient tradition. In modern terms, we would say that of the Pelasgians becomes an antiquarian issue. The witness of the historians make it possible to recover what has been lost in the selection process in the Scholia, but was probably present in Homer's exegesis, especially in the earliest stages. This confirms, on the one hand, the importance of Homeric witness for those investigating Greece's more remote past, and on the other hand, the presence of a strong lineage of Homeric exegesis within historical and geographical literature. Among the purposes of my analysis, there is also the need to stay away from too rigid barriers between genres and disciplines, not only between geography and historiography, but also between these and the techne grammaticae. Perhaps it's better to stop here. I have some pages about the Latin sources, but the time is not so much. Thank you very much.